Serverless is supposed to make architecture easier. So why does your system feel more fragile every time you add a Lambda? Why does your IAM policy look like legal text written during a panic? Why does debugging feel like forensic reconstruction? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Serverless doesn't remove complexity. It atomizes it. And when you atomize complexity, you don't scale, you fragment. Let's talk about why. Serverless scales extremely well. It scales stateless compute, concurrency, burst traffic, and infrastructure provisioning. You don't manage servers. You don't patch operating systems. You don't capacity plan the same way. From a resource perspective, it's brilliant. But infrastructure scaling is not architecture scaling. And that distinction is where the illusion begins. When you decompose aggressively into functions, you don't just split logic. You split invariants. In a monolith, certain truths are structural. This state must exist before that state. This operation must precede that one. This data must remain consistent. When you atomize into events and functions, those invariants become distributed assumptions. And distributed assumptions are fragile. Because now consistency isn't structural, it's behavioral. And behavior depends on coordination. As the number of functions grows, no single engineer sees the whole. Each function makes sense. The system does not. That's cognitive fragmentation. Serverless architectures don't just fragment spatially, they fragment temporally. Teams deploy independently. Event contracts evolve asynchronously. Retries replay logic written months ago. The system you debug today is not the system you deployed. It's the accumulated interaction of independent timelines. Without explicit contract governance, time becomes a hidden dimension of complexity. And scaling across time is harder than scaling across traffic. Now let's talk about observability. As systems fragment, signals multiply. More logs, more traces, more metrics. But more signals do not equal more clarity, they dilute it. Because observability without architectural intent becomes data exhaust. You don't lack information. You lack narrative. A request flows through API gateway, into a Lambda, into Event Bridge, and into another Lambda. Into a queue, into another Lambda, into a database, into a notification. One retry, one timeout, one idempotency oversight. Now you're not debugging a service, you're reconstructing a timeline. And when incident response requires interpretation rather than diagnosis, mean time to understanding increases. That's the scaling wall, not compute, understanding. Now let's talk about IAM. Every Lambda gets a role. Every role gets policies. Every policy evolves under delivery pressure, and everyone says, we follow least privilege. But least privilege is not a configuration. It's a control loop. It requires continuous permission analysis, access usage monitoring, drift detection, and regular policy refactoring. Without feedback loops, least privilege becomes statistical optimism. At 100 roles and 1,000 policies, you can't. You have statistical optimism. Validating least privilege at that scale requires central visibility, permission usage analytics, and dedicated review cycles. In other words, it requires a team. And this is the hidden scaling threshold. When your serverless architecture reaches a certain size, IAM governance becomes a full-time function. If you don't invest in feedback loops, permissions drift silently. You didn't remove complexity, you relocated it. Serverless removes infrastructure burden, but it introduces coordination burden. What begins as infrastructure elimination ends as platform engineering expansion. You didn't remove complexity, you relocated it, and relocation is not reduction. Serverless is a powerful scaling primitive, but it scales resources. It does not automatically scale coherence. If you scale execution without scaling understanding, you don't grow, you fragment. Scaling systems is easy, scaling understanding is not. Scaling understanding is architecture, and architecture is not infrastructure. This is systems thinking for architects.